Okay. So, there's lots of different parts of the brain that contribute to our feeling and our understanding of emotions. But the main ones that are really like dedicated specifically to regulating emotions are part of what's called the limbic system. And the limbic system is basically just the system of structures in the brain that are all connected. And I have some of them listed here. So one of the main ones is called the hypothalamus, which is kind of like, almost center of the brain, basically. And the hypothalamus is what's going to actually activate the sympathetic nervous system. So it has connections to, those peripheral, to the spinal cord, basically, which then controls the peripheral nervous system. So it's going to be the part that's going to turn on that physiological component. The amygdala is the main part that's going to process like the affective component or the actual feeling of the emotion. So the amygdala processes the emotion. And then the hippocampus is also linked to this. We talked a little bit about the hippocampus in the context of memory. So remember, the hippocampus is really important for like forming new memories. Whenever we initially learn something new, the hippocampus is kind of like taking that information and eventually we'll sort it out to the cortex and all of that. But it's also very intricately connected to the amygdala. And so, the hippocampus, really its job is to sort of code those emotional aspects of the memory, or to link, the emotional parts with the other parts of the memory, basically. So all three of those are really important for, processing the emotion as a whole. If you have damage to one of them, it's basically going to affect that, corresponding part. So if you had damage to the hypothalamus, that would, decrease that physiological response, kind of like I was talking about earlier. Damage to the amygdala would basically blunt the entire emotion. So you would lose both the physiological response and the affective component if you damage the amygdala. Something I don't have listed here, but we're going to talk about on the next slide, is also the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex, its job is mostly to kind of rationalize the emotion and to, do that like labeling, to basically sort of decide like cognitively, okay, I'm feeling all these things from the hypothalamus and the amygdala, that must be fear or that must be happiness. And the prefrontal cortex also plays a really important role in our decision making, which again is what I'll talk about on the next slide. All right, so I mentioned this at the very beginning, but there's kind of this conception that we tend to have that emotions are like the antithesis to logic. That if you're feeling emotional, then that's going to, prevent you from making like logical, rational decisions. And this is a thought that's kind of pervasive in our culture. And it turns out that it's not really very well supported, that actually if you have impairments in your emotions, then that also it disrupts decision making. One of the earliest examples that demonstrated this was a man named Phineas Gage. Many of you ever heard the story of Phineas Gage? I'm trying to think what context you would have. Probably not, since this is an intro psych course. This would be the first time you would learn it, I guess. But Phineas Gage was, he lived in like the late 1800s, and he worked on like building railroads, basically was his job. And specifically they were building railroads through like a mountain setting. And to do that, they have to like blow up these large sections of the mountain so they can like build a tunnel to get through it or whatever. And his job was to tamp down the explosives that they were using. So one person would come along, like make a hole in the mountain and fill it with a bunch of explosives. And then Phineas Gage would he had like this long rod, this long iron rod that he would use to like sort of pack it down so that it's like nice and tight. So he was doing that one day, something went wrong, and the explosives went off while he was tamping it down. And the iron rod went through his skull. So it fired, went like through the front of his face, out the top of his head, and, and kept going, basically. And kind of miraculously, he basically like stood up and was walking around, was talking, was like, seemingly okay, essentially. So they called the doctor, took him to a physician or whatever. They, sewed him up, did everything they needed to do to like keep him alive, keep him from bleeding out. And it didn't really affect like his, his overall intelligence. It didn't affect his motor skills, didn't affect like his language abilities, any of that. But it had really profound effects on his personality and the way that he regulated emotions, especially. So it seems that it basically severed, if I went back a slide, it severed the part that connected the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. So the amygdala itself is still intact so he can feel emotions, but it's cut the part that connects it to the prefrontal cortex that's really important for making decisions. So after this accident, he basically became very irresponsible, made all kinds of really terrible decisions. Before the accident, he had reportedly been like a really good worker, really good relationships with his family members and his friends. But after the accident, he lost his job, basically lost all his money. I think he was homeless for a stint of time, just had lots of bad decisions basically. And so what people think happened, so there's been other, kind of case studies similar to his since then. I mean, not similar in the way that it happened, but similar that someone had damage to either the amygdala or the part that connects the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. And they show this kind of similar pattern where they end up making really bad decisions. They go bankrupt, they get divorced, they have all kinds of just bad things happen in their life basically. And the kind of theory of why it happens is that normally, let's say, most people, you make a bad decision, you make a mistake, then you're going to have consequences of that mistake, and then you're going to feel some sort of emotion in response to those consequences. You're going to feel regret or shame, you're going to feel sadness, you might be angry at yourself, right? And all of those emotions serve basically as a punishment to prevent you from making those same mistakes again in the future. But if you don't have a connection between those emotions and the decisions you make, then you lose that punishment, basically. So someone like Phineas Gage or people who have had this kind of damage, they'll make the same mistakes over and over and over again because they're not getting that negative emotion to tell them hey, you shouldn't do that, that's bad. So that lack of emotion ends up, leading to these really bad decision-making patterns. Another thing that can happen that's pretty bizarre and very different from what I just described is something called Capgras syndrome. And this actually happens if there's damage to a more specific spot in the amygdala that connects to a part of our brain that's responsible for recognizing faces. So there's a part of the brain called the fusiform face area. And if the part between the amygdala and that area gets damaged, then it can result in Capgras syndrome. So someone with Capgras syndrome, basically what happens to them is they start to believe that everyone around them, everyone they love and care about, are imposters in some way. And they come up with all these crazy theories about why there would be an imposter living with them, some sort of governmental conspiracy or aliens or something. Really just crazy, irrational ideas about, how this person that's living beside me is not who, they appear to be. So my husband isn't really my husband, he's an imposter. Or my children aren't really my children, they're imposters. And the idea is kind of similar to what I was talking about with decision making, that basically if you lose that emotional connection to the face recognition, then the person, they'll look at their husband or their spouse or whatever, and they can recognize that looks like my spouse, but they don't have the emotional response that they're used to getting. They don't have the emotional response of feeling love or joy or whatever they would normally feel. So then they kind of their brain makes up this story to try to justify that lack of emotion. It basically says okay, this looks like my spouse, but it's not because they're not making me feel a particular way, so it must be an imposter.
What was the name of that spot in the brain that you said that was responsible for that?
It's the connection between the amygdala and the fusiform face area. That's what it's called. It's also kind of more generally sometimes just called the fusiform gyrus. So either of those terms, if you Google it or anything, should get you there. But yeah, one of the interesting things about Capgras syndrome, though, because it's only the connection between this face recognition area and the amygdala, if the same person hears their spouse's voice, over the phone, they don't have this absurd thought that they're an imposter. Because their voice is still connected to the amygdala. The voice will still activate that emotional response. But if they just see their face, then they have this weird, idea that their loved one is an imposter, basically. Usually, so Capgras syndrome and some of these other issues sometimes will result from like a stroke. If you have a stroke in that very specific area, then it can lead to some of the issues I'm describing. So again, kind of main takeaway here is that actually emotions are really important for good decision making and rational thinking. Okay, last thing I kind of want to leave you with in talking about emotion is kind of about, happiness, quality of life, like how to achieve happiness, maybe like a motivational talk a little bit to some extent. But I will say if you just started Googling about research on emotion in psychology or neuroscience or any of these fields, you're mostly going to find research on kind of negative emotions. There's a lot of research on fear. Part of the reason is because we do a lot of these studies on emotion with animals, and it's very easy to shock a rat or do something like that that's going to cause fear. So it's just kind of logistically easier to study those negative emotions than it is to study, how can you make a mouse happy is going to be a harder study to design, basically. You can give them food and stuff and give them, kind of like a little burst of dopamine or whatever. But if you're talking about especially long-term happiness, it's going to be very hard to measure in animal studies. So there's a lot less research done on positive emotions, but I think it's a really important field because obviously that's what we're all striving for, right? We're all striving to be as happy as we possibly can be. So more research in this area would be great. One of the areas of research that does exist, though, is this idea of what's called the hedonic treadmill. So the hedonic treadmill refers to this fact that most people have this kind of set point of happiness, and that you're going to stay pretty much at that set point for most of your life, regardless of what actually happens. So some people have this kind of false belief that if I just accomplish X, then I'm going to be so happy. It's going to make my life so much better, right? If I get this job where I can make this much money, I'm going to be so happy. If I can lose this much weight or gain this much weight, I'm going to be so happy. If I can get a spouse or a family, I'm going to be so happy, right? Everybody kind of has those beliefs that if I just do this one thing, then that's going to, make me super happy overall. But there's a lot of research that suggests that that's not the case at all. That typically whenever people have something like that happen, you get a raise, you start a new relationship, you get a new house, whatever, you will be a little bit happier for a short amount of time, maybe between a month to 3 months, it'll kind of boost your happiness. But very quickly you're going to drop back down to that kind of set point of happiness. And this, image kind of basically illustrates what that cycle looks like. So you have a desire for something, you strive for that, you obtain it, you have this brief period of enjoyment, but then eventually you adapt. You get used to whatever that new thing is, and you go back to kind of that, set point of happiness and desire more. So that whole cycle is what's called the hedonic treadmill. So, there's been studies where they track people, for example, who have won the lottery, we can also go the opposite direction. So they've also studied people who have something really terrible happen to them. There was one study where they specifically looked at people who had car accidents or other things that made them quadriplegic, to where they're in a wheelchair, they're basically paralyzed, and you would think that's going to have a very negative impact on a person's life, but it's kind of the same thing there. The really negative thing happens, they might suffer from depression or sadness for a little bit, but then they're going to come back up to that set point of happiness. So that can start to feel sometimes a little bit demoralizing, what's the point of trying anything if I'm always going to return back to this set point? What's the point of striving for things? But there's some interesting research that has shown that really the hedonic treadmill only keeps going if we focus on really superficial desires. So if we're looking for, fortune, fame, those kind of superficial things, that tends to keep us on the hedonic treadmill. So there are actually certain things that it seems can have more sustained long-term impacts on our happiness. And I have those listed here, basically. So one of them is learning new skills. So learning, new languages, new hobbies, things where we feel we actually have some control or autonomy, where we can make something with our hands, or increases basically our confidence in ourselves. That can sort of, more permanently increase that state of happiness. Developing strong relationships is another one that can, boost happiness overall. Improving overall health. So, you know, if you just focus on like one specific thing, like, oh, I want to lose weight so I can look good in a bikini, or I want to gain weight so, you know, I can be really muscular and strong or whatever, that typically keeps you on the hedonic treadmill. But if you focus on overall health instead, like I want to have a good, you know, healthy diet that's sustainable lifelong. I want to be at a good, healthy weight so that I can live a healthy, long life. You know, I want to get good sleep, all of that, like focusing more on overall health can actually increase that set point of happiness. And then things like conquering fears and developing healthy coping skills also have been shown to kind of more permanently increase that state of happiness. So if you ever find yourself feeling like this, you know, like I keep getting a promotion or I keep whatever, you know, getting to the next thing I want, but I don't really feel fulfilled or happy, then maybe come back to this slide and just think about, like, you know, are you focusing on the right thing, or are there other things you could be working on? They're going to help you, you know, sort of push that set point happiness higher. Okay. Any questions about emotion? All right. Well, then let's take like let's do like a 10-minute break because we're a little bit early right now. And then we'll come back and talk about personality. So if everyone could be back here by 10 at the latest, then we will move on to our next topic.